Are you ready? Let's go!
Don't you sometimes just want to talk about everything? You know, there's days when you can just talk about anything. Need to sit back and chat about nothing at all? Nothing but Julie, coming at you with fun and creative topics and interviews.
Did you hear Julie's podcast? She's got the greatest topics.
Come join the chat about everything, anything, and nothing. So unwind and tune in to Nothing But Julie. Great topics and cool interviews with some pretty awesome people. And now, without further delay, here's Nothing But Julie.
This is part 2 of my Is It Me series. Well, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Julie Schrager, and I am your podcast host for the Nothing But Julie podcast. Thank you so much for joining me again, and welcome to the second part of a 3-part series called Is It Me? And today we are going to focus on the work environment. So this is all about, is it me or am I the problem at work? Has this ever happened to you? Have you ever doubted yourself or thought possibly something is going on that might be out of your control? This is a podcast where we get curious about the messy, uncomfortable, and the often very personal questions that pop up in everyday life. Thank you so much for joining me for this second part of the 3-part series. So, am I always the problem at work? I mean, let's get real. Even saying that out loud, it feels kind of heavy. And if you've ever asked yourself this, then you know just how exhausting and confusing it can be. You got the constant wondering if you're the issue. I know that's happened to me when I was younger. Or if the environment around you is just off. So, today I am unpacking it. What it feels like to believe you're the problem. Where that belief comes from, and what parts might actually be yours to own. You sometimes need to know the difference. It's time, sometimes, to consider that maybe it's not you. Maybe it's the room you're in. I know there have been times in the past where I have thought way too many times that it's me, or I would immediately become defensive and think that if there's a meeting going on, they're talking about me. I mean, how full of myself am I? But how can you control that? You know, how can you control those negative thoughts? So let's talk about segment 1. What it feels like to think that you're the problem. Okay, so let's start here. Let's start with the emotional toll, okay? When you feel like you're the problem at work, it can feel like walking around with invisible weights on your shoulders. Maybe you're constantly rereading emails before you send them, or maybe shrinking yourself in meetings because you don't want to come off the wrong way, or you're putting on a certain face, or a smile, a phony smile. You might even hear something totally neutral like, "Can I give you some feedback?" Now I kind of tap the surface, or touch the surface. Tap this? What's tapped the surface? Touch the surface of this in part 1 of this particular series, where many people are not good with constructive criticism. And what I mean by that is simply people, instead of taking constructive criticism the way it should be taken, get out of touch and angry. And that's something that I did touch on earlier in the other episode. So, the whole can I give you some feedback, and you instantly feel panic. No, I'm just going to continue with what I'm going to say. I don't want to get off my little loop here. It's not because you're fragile, but because it feels like every piece of feedback confirms a fear you already have. That you're not good enough, or that you don't belong. And here's the tricky part. When that thought settles in, it starts to shape how you show up. You might become more guarded. You might stop sharing ideas. You might feel like you're walking on eggshells even when no one has said you should. I think that the walking on eggshells thing is almost that pinnacle, that point of when you start realizing what is happening to you. It's a quick brain red flag. It's not just draining, but it's dehumanizing. So, where does this come from? Now let's pause and ask. Really, where does that feeling come from? Sometimes it's internal. Maybe you're someone who holds yourself to impossibly high standards. And perfectionism, imposter syndrome, fear of disappointing others. Those things don't stay at home when we go to work. They pretty much ride shotgun. And other times, it's the environment. How are you supposed to be able to tell the difference between the two? If it's the environment, then it's a team culture that rewards sameness and punishes questions. A manager who never gives positive feedback. You know what that's called? There's a specific name for that when you have someone who doesn't give you positive feedback, and it's called microaggressions. Kind of. Look it up. Exclusion. Unclear expectations. You can begin to internalize dysfunction as a personal flaw. And in many cases, it's both. A workplace dynamic that it's already tough, combined with your personal patterns and your past experiences, that can create a perfect storm of doubt. So what is yours to own? And what isn't? That's a good one. And I'm not a psychologist, therapist. I am not a therapist, but I do have experience. And let me tell you something. If I can help someone, anyone, not go through some of the patterns that I had when I was younger, I will do that. I'm not saying I'm a god, and it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. But trust me when I tell you, I had a lot of anxiety and a lot of self-doubt when I was growing up. I would often question, where does this come from? And of course, the first thing I want to do is blame my parents, because that's what we do. We blame our parents for everything. But while some of it might have occurred due to parenting or lack thereof, you still have to take ownership of maybe the choices that you made when you were younger that made you become who you are. Or it could just be DNA and you're screwed, but you can do something about it. So what is yours to own and what isn't? Okay, so this is the messy part, but it's a necessary part. It's important to reflect. I mean, I can say, are there things I've done that contributed to tension or to misunderstandings? And have I avoided accountability because it's uncomfortable? Are there patterns I see across multiple jobs or teams? So it's not about blaming yourself. It's about reclaiming your power, and owning what's yours is a form of growth. And it's how we build better boundaries and relationships at work. And this is key, not everything is yours to own. You're not responsible for an unclear leadership. I mean, you're not responsible for someone else's bias or someone else's toxicity. You're not responsible for carrying a broken culture on your back. I mean, just because you're the one feeling the most doesn't mean you're the one doing the most damage. Sometimes asking, is it me, is a survival response, a way to make sense of chaos, right? So if it is you, maybe you can fix it. But what if it's not? That's scarier, because it means you might have to leave or speak up or disappoint people. But to me, clarity is freedom. And you're allowed to say, this isn't healthy for me, even if I'm good at surviving it. I think that there are times when you realize you can fix things, and there are times when you can't. What can you do to make yourself get in that zone? Sometimes there are generations that don't realize what they're doing and that they have to fix it until maybe it's brought to their attention. So what can you do to bring attention to all of these things going on in your head? Well, I'm going to go back to segment 1 for a minute. What it feels like to think that you're the problem. Okay? You start editing yourself. Not just in writing, but in how you speak, how often you speak, how much your personality you let through. And then you start to question your instincts and your tone and your worth. And you may even start bracing yourself for conflict, even when nothing's actually happening. And I'll tell you, this internal tension builds up. You start to feel tight in your body and drained at the end of the day. But not because the work is hard, but because the performing is. You know, you're carrying this constant sense of maybe I'm messing this up, even when no one says that out loud. That's a huge weight, that pressure. It can make a healthy workplace feel unbearable, and it can make a toxic one feel like confirmation of your worst fears. How does that sound? Does it sound like that's something that you do? Let me tell you something. Getting into your head isn't easy. Getting into your head when you finally can is not easy for you to resolve conflict. Sometimes you need to hear it from somebody, a therapist, a friend that knows you very well. What do you think you can do? What things can you do when you realize it is you? Or you're just making yourself crazy with all of that mental stress? There have to be some realistic and thoughtful ideas for fixing all of these, some of these, maybe all of them. What can you do to fix the feeling when you think you're always the problem? You know, you're stuck in anxiety or hypervigilance or overcorrection at work. I think one of the things that can help is name the pattern. Start by noticing when you're spiraling. You have to start noticing. Catch the thought, I must have done something wrong, and replace it with something feels off. Let me pause before I blame myself. You can build a reality check circle. You can identify one or two trusted people inside or outside of work, like I said before, friends, family, therapists, who can help you gut check situations. I've done this before, and there have been times when I thought I was so right in my feelings, and the person that I would speak to would tell me, oh, you see, I wouldn't see it this way. And that person would give me a different perspective. And then I would kind of train myself into, thinking in that respect. You can say, does this seem like a me thing? Or a team thing? Or even a system thing? That's a really great reality check building process. All right? They can help you gut check those situations by asking yourself, does this seem like a me thing, a team thing, or a system thing? It kind of breaks that cycle also of obsessively thinking that things are constantly you. You can also practice neutral self-inquiry. Now, what's that? Sounds like a term I just copied off the internet, and you might be right. But let's think about what that means, self-inquiry. Instead of, why am I always like this? Try, what made me feel unsafe in that moment? So what happens to the mind when you kind of shift your thoughts to curiosity? It reduces shame and it invites clarity. Words, man, I'm telling you, are powerful. Your brain is mostly in a fight or flight pattern. And depending on how you are, who you are, your brain might automatically choose the flight, or your brain might choose fight. Either way, when you get into a spiral of mental unclarity, these are great coping mechanisms. The next thing I would recommend or suggest is to untangle where it comes from. Okay, so what's happening? Old wounds, you can have identity-based trauma or even past toxic jobs. Those are shaping how you interpret present-day dynamics. I mean, it's the age-old thing where we are always an example of our past, but we sometimes don't always realize what's happening to us from there could be so many things buried in that subconsciousness, that vast subconsciousness that has just been pushed so far down that you don't even know that you might be acting or reacting in a certain way due to what has been pushed down so deep. I think what can help with these old wounds and past toxic jobs, I think what can help with how you interpret present day dynamics through all of these past things that shaped you. I'm going to just say it. Don't stop when I say it. There's a reason. So just hang on tight. Therapy or coaching with an identity lens. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, I love the word unpack. Unpack whether your reactions are self-protective responses from past experiences and learn how to respond instead of react. I'm going to say that one more time, even though you can rewind it. Unpack whether your reactions are self-protective responses from past experiences, and learn how to respond instead of react. I'll just leave that right there. You can also create a personal workplace manual. I think that this is something where you can create like a private document where you clarify first what triggers me at work. Now, sometimes these are not tangible questions you can ask, or I should say is a question that is not a tangible thought. You might not know what it is. But if you're someone who is constantly upset about things, when that thing hits that is upsetting you, that is when you are triggered. So what triggers me at work? And what environments help me thrive? And also, what behaviors from others do I tend to misread? Now, that's an important one. When you are in such a mental spiral and you haven't given yourself a break or just a few words to help yourself break that cycle of thoughts, it is very hard to create this personal workplace manual. But if you've had someone say something to you, or if you're aware, but you're not doing anything about it, I promise you, once you do start doing something about it, you are going to live a much happier life. You will break free from this mental pressure and stress. Now, also, something that's very important is something that happened to me, which is I started to notice repetition. Like the same pattern would show up. And if this happens to you, let's say across different jobs, take a compassionate inventory of your own habits and assumptions. You're not broken, you're patterned. You're just patterned. And this one's going to be a hard one, but I'm just going to say it. Taking ownership without over-owning. What does that mean? So here's what's happening. You're unsure how to grow without blaming yourself for everything. So what can help? Well, you can ask for a specific, actionable feedback. What does that mean? Well, you can say, what's one thing I could do differently in a meeting? That is so much more empowering than, what am I doing wrong? Flip the verbiage. Flip it. Your brain will get used to it. What is the one thing I could do differently in meetings? Rather than, what am I doing wrong? And you can separate your character from your behavior. You know, I sometimes will talk over people when I'm nervous. It's very rare, not that I'm not nervous. It's rare that I do talk over people, but it is sometimes when I'm nervous and sometimes when the person is annoying me so much because they're not letting me get a word in edgewise. But if I were to say, again, this is separating your character from your behavior. If I say, I talk over people sometimes when I'm nervous. Think about saying, I'm bad at collaborating. Just focus on what you do, not who you are, what you do, what you're good at, what you're not good at. Admit it to yourself. And then all of a sudden, it's like, I never thought that there would be a time when I would actually be saying to people, I'm in menopause, out loud, because I never heard it from my mom. It's a huge stigma. I grew up in a life of having two parents that, you know, one of which was seriously, you know, mentally ill and the other one semi. And I had to learn how to do a 180-degree turn to not become that way. Do you know how hard that was? I forget how old. I'm going to say in my early 20s, because I'm not sure of the actual age, but it was very early 20s, 2021, when I went to a behavioral therapist. And every time I called, it just rang and it rang and it rang. Now, this was, back in the late 80s. Late 80s. And I was so aggravated that I couldn't get in touch with this very reputable cognitive behavioral therapist that I walked straight into his office during a time when I had read in some kind of advertisement that he was holding a clinic. I walked in there and I waited until the end of the clinic, and I waited for all of the people in there to leave, and I stopped him and I told him, I have been trying to contact you. I have been trying to make an appointment with you, but to no avail. I don't know if I use that word. I need you to help me. I need to start seeing you. I need to make an appointment with you as soon as possible. I can't become my parents. You need to help me. That is what I said to him. And I remember this so specifically. He just stood there. Like, I don't know if it was shock. I don't know. But he said to me, I was about ready to ask you to leave and to call my secretary. But because of what you said, I'm very interested. Let me see my next availability. I saw this man for 2 years, and he's the one that said, there's nothing more we can do. I was a changed person, but I didn't know it at the time. I had all the coping skills. I had been deliberately placed into situations that would push me to use these coping skills and trick my brain. And it worked. It worked. And so to this day, to this exact day, I still use those skills, and I am actually able to, not all the time, but sometimes be able to use them. And that is why I want to help you. I want to also mention a few other really quick things you can do, like using the 30-30-40 model. A lot of people talk about the 5-4-3-2-1 model. Think of 5 things that you can touch, 4 things you can feel. See, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can taste. And this is very similar. You can reflect on what 30% of this situation is mine, and what 30% belongs to the other person, and what 40% is just structural, messy, or unclear. You should write this down because it's really good advice. But this does help you zoom out and keep things in perspective. What about if you do have a toxic or dysfunctional work culture? You need to navigate that. So here's what's happening. You've realized it's not you and that the system is flawed. So what can help? Well, documenting everything. If you're dealing with gaslighting or inconsistent feedback or even exclusion, keep that paper trail. It will protect you, and it will help you to see patterns. If you could find an internal ally, someone from another team or HR, if you have an HR, who can give honest insight, like what's normal versus what's personal. They might have more insight into all of this. And you can also practice detached engagement. Do your job well, but stop tying your worth to this system. Don't overgive to prove you deserve to be there. You already do. And of course, plan an exit if needed, but strategically. So if the environment isn't changing, just map out a timeline and plan to leave. It's not quitting. That's reclaiming. Reclaiming your confidence and rewriting the narrative. Even when you know you're not the problem, you still feel small. So what can help? Create a proof folder. We have a tendency of forgetting certain things. If you keep a private folder with positive feedback and thank you notes and great project outcomes, that would be perfect and would remind you of your value. And reintroduce yourself in meetings or emails. Don't downplay your voice. Try, I bring a perspective we haven't covered yet. Or based on my experience managing blank, here's what I've seen work. So you have to change the question. Instead of, is it me? Ask, is this place good for the version of me I'm becoming? And what do I know to be true about my value, even if this room doesn't see it yet? If you're listening to this and realizing you might be making someone else feel like they are the problem, well, kudos for your self-awareness. So here are some next steps. Ask your team if there's anything you can do that makes it, let me rephrase that. Is there anything that you do that makes it hard to bring your full self to work? There's nothing wrong with practicing curiosity before correction. Help me understand what you were seeing here. There are nicer ways to ask questions to get an answer. Normalize feedback in both directions and actually act on it. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. This was chock full of information. And if you found yourself in today's episode, download the episode and give yourself the space to explore with care. It's very important, self-care. We're on this earth for a very short period of time. Thank you so much for joining me. And just remember, you deserve to work in places where your thoughtfulness is an asset, not a liability, and where your boundaries aren't questioned, but respected, where you don't have to over-explain your humanity to be treated humanely. It isn't just about work, it's about worth. Until next time, I'm Julie from Nothing But Julie Podcast. Thanks so much for joining me. Feel free to find me on any streaming platform and follow my Instagram page and TikTok and Facebook at Nothing But Julie.